We learned from mercantilism that the colonies were established to make money for the crown. But how did that process work? It was known as the colonial cycle. The king gave English subjects the right to occupy the land, and this was called a charter. These subjects would go to the new land, and they would make money. The colonists would then send a portion of this money back to the king, and this is how the king accumulated wealth for the crown. The king's sole interest was making this money, and he didn't worry about the political or social lives of the colonists. This was called salutary neglect. Essentially, under salutary neglect, the king allowed the colonists to do whatever they wanted as long as he was making his money. The colonists were able to practice new governments in an attempt to see what would work. This valuable experience would aid the founding fathers in the creation of a new government.
The colonial interests of Britain and France conflicted in 1754, leading to the outbreak of the French and Indian War. This conflict pitted the French and their Native American tribe allies against the British and their colonial allies. Attempting to drive the British out of North America and seize colonial control for themselves, the French invaded the British colonies by force. They armed their Indian allies and got them to fight along with them. The British threw their full military might to protect the colonies from French invasion and keep them under their control. After years of bloody conflict, the British and the colonies were victorious and defeated the French and the Indians in this war. But the defense of the colonies was very expensive, and it placed a heavy economic toll on the crown.
After the French and Indian War, the British colonists were eager to move west and enjoy the spoils of victory. But with doing this, they were encroaching on Native American land, and this angered the Native Americans. To prevent hostility, King George issues the Proclamation of 1763. In an attempt to keep the Native Americans happy, the proclamation states that the British colonists are not allowed to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. If colonists already lived there, they had to move back. This angered the colonists, and they moved there anyway. They felt that they had just won a war for this land, and they should reap the rewards.
But the French and Indian War to protect the colonies was also costly for the crown. And in order to recoup some of the money spent on the war, the British Parliament decided to enact a series of taxes on the colonists. The first tax enacted was the Sugar Act. Enacted in 1764, the Sugar Act was an indirect tax that taxed the producers of products made from sugar. An indirect tax means that consumers didn't pay for the tax, the producers paid for it. Although this tax increased the price of sugar products, it didn't come directly out of the pockets of the colonists. Items included in this tax were sugar, molasses, textiles, dye, coffee, and wine. Feeling in part that this tax was unfair, colonists began to question whether the king had the right to impose a tax on them, when they had no say in the election process in England.
Another tax that was implemented was the Stamp Act in 1765. This was the first direct tax placed on the colonist. A direct tax means that the consumer pays for the tax out of pocket. Paper goods that the colonists purchased had a stamp on them, and this stamp meant that there was an additional tax paid on this product. This angered the colonists more than the Sugar Act because they saw the price of the item go up directly. They felt this tax more than the Sugar Act. Colonists began to protest the tax and refused to pay tax collectors. This sometimes got violent, and the tax collectors were assaulted. The Stamp Act led to the slogan, "No taxation without representation," which would become a rallying cry during the Revolution.
Tensions in the colonies came to a head in 1770 at the Boston Massacre. An angry colonial crowd surrounded soldiers at the Customs House in Boston, Massachusetts. The colonists were protesting the occupation of the city of Boston by British soldiers. The soldiers were present in order to keep order and helped enforce the collection of taxes. The protesters harassed the British soldiers and threw snowballs filled with rocks. Startled by the protesters, a British soldier accidentally discharged his rifle, and then the entire squad opened fire. 3 protesters died instantly on the scene, and 2 more died later on. The event was depicted in a famous engraving by the patriot Paul Revere, and the engraving was circulated around the colonies in order to drive up support for the rebellion against King George. The event was called a massacre, even though only 5 died, in order to play on the emotions of the colonists and garner support for the cause.
In another attempt to recoup the cost of the French and Indian War, King George imposes the Tea Act in 1773. This is a tax imposed on all imported tea. This essentially grants a monopoly on tea trade to the British East India Company. With a tax on imported tea and the monopoly for the East India Company, this made tea more expensive for the colonists.
Outraged by the Tea Act, Massachusetts colonists decided to stage the Boston Tea Party. In 1773, a patriot protest group known as the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Mohawk Indians and boarded 3 British tea ships in Boston Harbor. The protesting colonists threw 342 crates of British tea into Boston Harbor, destroying $1.7 million worth of tea in today's money. By destroying the tea, the colonists took away the ability of the British Crown to collect taxes on it. This act of protest greatly angered King George III, and he decided to issue the Intolerable Acts in response.
Issued in 1774, the Intolerable Acts had 4 main points. First, accused colonists would be tried in England. This outraged the colonists, because it almost ensured that anyone brought to England would be found guilty of their crime, and the colonists felt they would not get a fair trial of their peers. This gave the king a simple way to get rid of his political enemies. All he had to do is charge them with a crime and bring them to England, and they could sit there until they were no longer a benefit to the rebellion. The second point was the king closed Boston Harbor, hurting the local economy. With Boston being a main port in the colonies, they were no longer able to import goods from England. In addition to this, people lost jobs working in the port. Third, Massachusetts elections would be held under the control of the crown. This allowed the king to place people that would support his ideas in charge. And finally was the colonial quartering of troops. This forced the colonists to place British soldiers in their homes. Imagine being forced to put an occupying soldier in your home. You had to feed them and give up your bed. Wouldn't that tick you off?
With the Intolerable Acts in place, colonial leaders decided to convene in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. This meeting in 1774 was the first assembly of members from all of the 13 colonies. At the Congress, colonial leaders declared that the Intolerable Acts were unconstitutional and violated their rights as British subjects. They urged colonists everywhere to arm themselves in anticipation of an armed revolution.
A year later, members again convened to form the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress would be the governing body of the colonies through the Revolutionary War. They elected George Washington to be the leader of the Continental Army. The Continental Army was needed because the British had opened fire on the colonists at Lexington and Concord. This would be known as the shot heard round the world, and this is why Lexington and Concord is known as the first battle of the Revolutionary War. But not every colonist supported the revolution. Some were known as loyalists, and they remained loyal to the crown, while those who supported the revolution were known as patriots. In an attempt to avoid a bloody war, the Second Continental Congress sent out a last-ditch effort known as the Olive Branch Petition. They appealed to the crown to avoid war. This failed, and the two nations were hurled into a bloody war for independence.
The road to the American Revolution was paved by a war between France and Britain, a series of taxes placed on the colonists, resistance to those taxes, a bloody massacre in the streets of Boston, an act of protest in Boston Harbor, and the formation of a colonial government. But it would take another 8 years of bloody conflict between the British and the American colonists to give birth to the United States of America.